Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Temporal 3 podcast, where we talk about fire alarm. I'd like to introduce my co host today, Mr. Gene LaValle. Gene, welcome.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate you inviting me on.
And also Mr. Charles Aulner.
Hello. Hello, Gene.
Welcome, guys.
Hey, Charles, how
Good.
are you? Hey, you got as
Good.
much snow as we have?
Uh, no, we have no snow, but I'm excited to talk about fire.
Me too.
Awesome. Well, the first thing I'd like to talk about today, of course, our first topic is always NICET and about documentation questions on the NICET exam, particularly the NICET fire alarm exam. Charles, what has been your experience with the NICET fire alarm exam as far as documentation
Well,
questions?
what I hear from students is we don't really get documentation questions. They just ask us questions about the paperwork.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I had um it's funny how documentation plays such a more important role now that it does than it has in the past. And it's which is evident of how the industry continues to evolve, more emphasis on liability documentation and things like that. When I got my certification, that was 1990, and there wasn't a lot of questions on documentation there because the chapter hadn't even fully developed as it has. And but I try to, I really embrace it. You look at 72 now and the requirements for documentation, and there's a lot of stuff in there that most people don't even consider adding to the plans. I think it's going to continue to get better now, primarily because a lot of municipalities, it's been my experience, are subcontracting out the plan review process. So it's going maybe to a local engineering firm who's a little bit more up to snuff on what's contained in the standards, and their review is a little bit more stringent than what you might expect to get from a local authority having jurisdiction. And they're really starting to hold your feet to the fire on the items in Chapter 7, as far as the documentation is concerned.
And you're absolutely right. In chapter 7 is an important point. I believe 2013 is when that chapter first appeared. And prior to that, you're right. We had some basic requirements for documentation in the fundamentals chapter of 72. But when they put an entire chapter in of 72 and moved everything documentation and added all that required minimum documentation for fire alarm systems, that was a game changer,
Oh, yeah.
both in the real world and in the NICET exam.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even something as simple as the document enclosure that, as someone who does design work now, I make sure that's an item that's on all the plans. And I try to put the burden on my customers that are doing the install. I'm like, look, I put the document enclosure there because it's required to be there. All right. That means I want you need to put it in, right? Because it's on the plans and it's on the approved plans, so make sure you add the document box, document enclosure, or at least a note in the fire panel where the documents are located, because that's your other option. If you don't have a document box, you could leave, excuse me, a note at the fire panel that would indicate where are the documents.
Well, Gene, I think that's only half of the equation. They need to put the documents in the box once it's installed.
Yes. You mean rolling them up and sticking behind the circuit board of the fire panel is no longer acceptable?
Not acceptable.
Yeah,
How
yeah.
about outside the panel behind the conduit?
No.
Yeah, yeah, that's, it's funny you had mentioned that because that's a question I always ask when we're doing the NICET classes or when I'm doing the class and we get to the topic of as-built wiring diagrams. And I always ask the class, when was the last time you took over a project that had an accurate set of as-built wiring diagrams? And everybody takes that opportunity to sort of laugh because they just don't provide them. And it's almost as if a lot of companies they don't want to leave too much information behind to make it easier for a competitor to take the account over. It's kind of a silly reason, but the documentation is there specifically for a good reason. And I often tell people as well to seek that out. When I'm doing my trainings, I tell people, look, you need to look for the documentation. because I would not take over a project that did not have the proper documentation. You're assuming a whole lot of liability, and the things that have been properly installed, tested, that there is a record of completion. If you don't get that stuff up front, that changes my whole approach to the job, because I would have to build in then a separate, retesting of the entire system to make sure I'm taking something over that's going to work properly.
Yeah, that's a huge difference in price. I'm sorry, Charles, you were going to say something.
I was going to ask a question, Brian. Does the code give us any guidance on that if we run into a system that doesn't have any documentation about what we're supposed to do?
Yeah, if you don't have an ROC, 72 requires that you complete one based upon the scope of work. Now, it doesn't require an as-built drawing because that may not be possible to complete, but it does require a new record of completion to be created based upon, and as Gene said, that's a lot of work. That could be the difference between a simple takeover and basically, a whole lot of hours documenting an existing system, creating a new baseline for the fire alarm system.
Got to have it.
You sure do. And matter of fact, I got a call 2 days ago from a competitor, a manufacturer, and he wanted to buy some components to add to a system that was not his. And I said, "Well, I would suggest you contact, the person who installed it." And he goes, "Oh, I can't." I said, "Look in the panel. There's got to be a sticker or something. I mean, the documentation requirements are mandated by the building code. There's got to be something there that would
Right.
indicate who's testing the system. Call him, and or call them, and see if you can't get the parts you need in that respect." I just don't understand how that, which it becomes the most important aspect of the system, is one of the most often overlooked.
Absolutely. So we all feel that documentation is important, and I can tell you all too, and I know you all have seen this as well in talking to our students that NICET does as well. And generally, documentation questions on the exam will start at level 2, and the higher you go in the levels, the more questions you're going to get about documentation, and the more challenging the questions are going to be about documentation. And one issue that people encounter with documentation and why documentation is such a big challenge on the exam is, as you fellas mentioned, real world versus code world. How does NICET base their questions, Charles? Do they base them on your experience?
They base them on what's written in the codes.
Bingo. Exactly. So the next thing I'd like to talk about, guys, a question we often get about code is what's the difference between the different types of drawings that are required for a fire alarm system and where are they used? Charles, are there minimum drawing requirements in the code?
There are. The code requires that we have uh, riser diagrams. Code requires that we have floor plans, and there are specific requirements for each of those as well. Gene, what have you seen?
Yeah, definitely. In the real world, where I think it gets a little confusing, oftentimes, I mean, there's no confusion in the standard. The standards is pretty straightforward in terms of, the minimum documentation that's required. And when it goes into talking about design documents, the first entry, 732, I forget which one it is, but it has an annex reference. And the annex reference, all it says in the annex is refer to 7.2 for the minimum documentation. And it goes on to list a bunch of it. But where a lot of guys get thrown is they start confusing. I think the reality is most of the fire alarm work is done via the new construction bid process. And there's typically a set of design, drawings. They may be preliminary, but somebody at some point sat down and did a fire alarm design. The challenge that we face in the industry is, was his design worth the darn? Is it going to pass an inspection? And so typically, when it gets to us, we take those bid documents and we have to create the proper documentation, so to use in the submittal, for example, the shop drawing. Sometimes they refer to them as shop. I think 72 actually does refer to them as shop drawings, but that's what we put together based on, our assessment of the initial system and how we bid the job. And, one of the things that was always so frustrating is oftentimes when our customers bid work like that, they'll bid a job per plans and specs only to find out it doesn't pass the inspection or it's not going to pass an inspection. So part of our challenge is, we look at it and you may have to offer two prices, one based on plans and specs and one based on what it's going to take to pass an inspection. It involves
Bingo.
extra work on our part, but it's the only way to properly do that without getting caught, holding the bag, so to speak. And you get to the end and all of a sudden you got a fire official that says, oh, I need to see this, 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 and that, or, extra stuff, because then it becomes finger pointing. Well, who's going to pay for that? And all that other stuff. So,
So the
sometimes
shop
spend
drawings, Brian, they come after the design drawings have been approved. Is that correct?
Right, and at least in terms of NFPA 72, now that's one of the things that we need to have clarity on, at least from the NICET exam perspective, because NICET does lay out 3 stages of drawings for the fire alarm. The first one being the design or layout drawings, which are a preliminary design. Let's call them our bid drawings that we submit to the AHJ for approval. So this is what we want to do with the fire alarm system that we're presenting to Mr. AHJ or Miss AHJ and saying, hey, here's what I want to do. And that goes back to what Gene said. You could do it according to code or specs, excuse me. And then you can go back and say, here's my spec design, but also here's what it's actually going to take to pass because I know this AHJ and I know what he wants. Would you agree with that, Gene?
Yeah, I would think that's part of the challenge that we face in the industry. And it just gets down to where, as our customers, so to speak, our engineered systems distributors, for lack of a better description, I think we could agree that the majority of the fire alarm work is done in that channel, and it's done typically by the electrical contractor. The electrical contractor typically will run the conduit and pull the wire and even mount the peripheral devices. And he buys a package that we affectionately refer to as parts and smarts from a qualified, competent low voltage contractor or engineered systems distributor who has all the licensing, the fire alarm licensing and all that other stuff. So he buys his package, and then we just have to tell him, like Charles said, look, I went over that. Here's your price per plans and specs, but I know this occupancy, I know this municipality, those plans were lacking this, 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 and this, and I just don't want to get caught having to pay for them. So when push comes to shove, this is what it's going to cost you to add those items that whoever did the design work initially left off. Because I would look at
Absolutely.
all that stuff that's bid is preliminary. When you get a set of blue lines from a contractor, a lot of times they're even marked preliminary, and which is a good indication that they haven't thoroughly been reviewed. And they're not for construction. A lot of times they'll even be stamped not for construction on the plans, right?
Mm,
So there's a lot of
wow.
work that has to be done post bid, and it falls on the fire alarm contractor and his knowledge and understanding of the documentation in NFPA 72. And like I said,
Absolutely.
because a lot of these municipalities are pressed for personnel, they subcontract the plan review to a local engineering firm who's also looking for work. And, the county pays him to review it, and he goes through because he has a better understanding. And he
So,
starts nitpicking it, and I need this, I need, and you kick it back a couple of times in the
Gene,
in
let somebody
the
else talk. You're dominating the conversation here with
we
minutia.
got
uh,
we wound it's our fault, Charles. We wound Gene up.
Yeah, you
yeah.
need to chill out, dude.
All right. All right.
So Charles, what's the next step in the design process according to 72?
Well, one thing I want to kind of emphasize here is all this documentation and design stuff that we're talking about, that's the plan. And if we develop a plan for a fire system that sucks, what's going to happen with the installation?
It too is going to suck.
Yeah,
It too is great. Yeah.
exactly. So that's why this is such an important thing in my view. Brian, how do you feel about that?
Oh, absolutely. Fail to plan, plan to fail.
Love that
You
anyway.
have a bad plan, you're going to have a bad installation, you're going to have issues with the AHJ, you're going to have a ruined reputation, and probably not get a heck of a lot more work.
And a building that's less safe.
That's less
Yes,
safe.
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, according to 72, the next step in the drawing process is the shop or installation drawings. And these are the design drawings that are approved by the AHJ that a copy goes on site that are marked up. And we're marking up as we do the installation. Why do we mark them up? What happens during the actual installation, Charles?
Well, unfortunately, the plan doesn't always go as planned. And when we hit the ground, things change. The AHJ wants an adjustment. The HVAC people put something in the way of our smoke detector, who knows what. So these little issues come up.
Absolutely.
Gene, how do we deal with those in the field?
It's a favorite quote of mine, Mike Tyson. Everybody has a plan till they get punched in the face. And a lot of times your AHJ is going to punch you in the face at the end of the project, as it relates to those plans. So
Absolutely. The final step in the drawings, according to 72, is the record or as-built drawings, the final installation drawings, as Gene mentioned, the drawings that never seem to be available, particularly when you're taking over a fire alarm system. And they're designed to show the final installation of the system. And one of the things that I like to say about the record drawings or the as-built drawings, we got to remember these are a living document, because if we make changes to the fire alarm system, what do we have to do? We have to create a new record or as-built drawing. Now, I know, Charles, does that ever usually happen in the real world? Or probably I should ask Gene, does that ever happen in the real world? Do things get changed and not updated?
things get changed all the time, and they're not always reflected on the drawings. That's why, like you said, to your point, and I don't want to overlook it, is the once we get the approved drawings on site, they have to be on site, and we mark them up. Those and then we put marks on them, because a lot of times, you know, you put devices on paper, and even if it's questionable. Some designers will indicate wire routes and conduit routes, and some AHJs insist upon that. Some don't. I mean, I've seen them done both ways. But even if you do show the wire routes, um, oftentimes in the real world, you can't get wire from that, point A to point B. So we got to reroute the wire. And in so doing, it becomes necessary to maybe update our voltage drop calculations and all that other stuff. So it's important to know, once we got a set of approved plans, they're left on the job site, and whoever does the install marks them up as the system is actually installed, or shows the wire runs or whatever, to make sure, so that when all is said and done, we've got an accurate plan to do the service and support that ultimately follows an installation like that.
Absolutely. So finally, guys, I'd like to talk about a question from the field. We had a question about from a student who installs fire alarm systems and wants to get into the design side, and was asking, what's the best method of designing fire alarm systems? Is the old pencil and paper probably the best way, guys?
Draw it on a napkin.
Draw it on a napkin. That's right.
Say, for those new guys that are interested in that, they could call me and I'll design it for them. The bulk of my business is doing that these days. But I got to put a plug in for there's a software package out there that you do training on, that FireCAD. And if you're going to seriously consider designing, I would definitely look at a software package like that makes your job a little bit easier, and can double check you. I mean, I like to do my calculations manually, but it's nice when I have a computer to bounce them off of. If I run wire from point A, this gauge wire from point A to point B, and it'll do the voltage drop calculations in the background. So it uses the checks and balances on what I'm doing, how my calculations come out. So I would certainly give my recommendation to take advantage of the technology.
Hey, that's such an important thing, not just on the FireCAD side, but I think also on the estimating side as well. Back in the day, you'd walk a job and say, I think it'll take 3 hours to run a wire from here to there. How long does it always take?
Twice what you estimate.
Absolutely.
Easy.
Double
Yes.
what you think. With estimating software, it makes it so much easier to get a more accurate representation of everything, pricing for everything. You look at
one that we've
just
Charles
installing
and
a
I have
device.
seen.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
No, I was gonna say one that Charles and I have seen is a company called IntelliBid, and it's geared towards electrical, but they basically have set it up so that they will give you down to the screws required for a particular installation, and it's really, really cool. And partnering that with a product like FireCAD, really gives you the full package, and is definitely worth the investment. If you're going to do that work, do it right. Make it easy on yourself.
Yeah, and that software helps so much in design and estimating. So definitely.
Gene, you're both of us are fans of FireCAD, obviously, and you've obviously had a lot more experience with than I have. Was there a learning curve for you to learn to use FireCAD?
Yeah, it was a small curve. The biggest challenge is the AutoCAD function because it comes with an OEM version of AutoCAD. So depending upon your skill level with AutoCAD, that may lengthen your learning curve a little bit, but I find it to be very intuitive, and their approach, to design. I mean, they've got when you do a design, you do it based on the manufacturer. Their database is very robust. So if I want to design a simplex system or if I want to design an Edwards system, it's in there by the manufacturer's part numbers.
Well,
And as I'm plotting devices, it's doing the calculations in the background all the time. So, I mean,
Gene,
and then they become reports.
Gene,
Charles. Yeah.
the measuring stick here is it easy enough to use that Brian could do it?
Yes.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
so. I think so.
Yeah,
There
I
you
had
go.
a
That's
it's a
the
winner.
deal right there. Yep,
If
absolutely.
I can figure it out, anybody can figure it out. And I will say that there was a learning curve for me because CAD is completely different than any other program I've ever used.
Yeah.
But once I got it figured out, yeah, I found it to be very, very intuitive.
Yes.
Well, as Gene mentioned earlier, if that's not something you want to jump into, Gene does also, as his sideline, Signal Pro Inc. do fire alarm designs. He will design your fire alarm system for you. I encourage you to go to signalproinc.com that's the correct website, right,
Yes,
Gene?
that's good. I appreciate the plug.
Check out Gene's site, communicate with Gene about doing that design work for you, and maybe someday when you feel comfortable with FireCAD, you buy a copy yourself and start doing your own.
Thanks, Brian.
All right. Well, guys, that concludes the session today. I appreciate your time and appreciate all the participation. For our listeners out there, I look forward to seeing you all in the next podcast.
Sounds
Thanks
good.
again.
Thank
Thanks,
you for the
guys.
invite.
Bye, everyone.